Around 40,000 years ago, somewhere in what is now Europe, two people stood on opposite sides of a valley. One of them was you, not literally, but their blood runs in your veins. The other was different, a different species, a different kind of human with a slightly larger brain than yours, who had lived on this continent for over 200,000 years before your ancestors arrived. Within a few thousand years of that meeting, their entire species was gone. You are the reason they don't exist anymore. You just don't remember doing it. Here is what most people think they know about human evolution. One line, one species, a slow, clean march from something small and hunched to something upright and modern. You've seen the diagram, ape on the left, you on the right, but that diagram is wrong. Not as a simplification, wrong as a description of what actually happened. For most of the last 3 million years, there were multiple species of human alive at the same time. Not just one, not two. At various points, at least 4 or 5 completely different kinds of human beings were sharing this planet. Different brains, different bodies, different tools, different ways of reading the night sky and surviving the cold. One species made it to today, the rest are gone. And the timing of their disappearance is not a coincidence. The ones most people have heard of are the Neanderthals, and the image most people carry is wrong. They were not the brutish, hunched, blank-eyed creatures that a century of pop culture put in their heads. Neanderthals were sophisticated. Their brains were larger than yours on average, not in the frontal lobe, which handles long-range planning and abstract thought, but in the regions that process vision and physical coordination. They were built for a different kind of intelligence. Shorter and stockier, with barrel chests and thick bones, adapted to the brutal cold of Ice Age Europe over hundreds of thousands of years. We would not have survived those winters. They were built for them. But they were also something harder to dismiss. They buried their dead. Archaeologists have found Neanderthal graves in Iraq, France, Israel, and Spain, bodies placed deliberately, sometimes with tools arranged beside them. They used pigments to decorate their bodies and shells to make jewelry. They made musical instruments, and they cared for their sick. One Neanderthal skeleton found in Shanidar Cave in Iraq belonged to a man who had survived a completely shattered eye socket, a crushed arm that had been amputated at the elbow, and a severe arthritis so advanced it had fused parts of his spine. He lived for years after those injuries, which means people kept him alive, fed him, protected him, carried him, in some sense, so that he could keep existing in a world that had already broken his body apart. This is not a creature. This is a people. Then, roughly 45,000 years ago, Homo sapiens arrived in Europe. And something began. Something that took thousands of years to play out, that left almost no direct record, and that scientists have spent decades piecing together from sediment layers and broken tools and fragments of bone too small to identify without a microscope. Within 5,000 to 10,000 years of first contact, the Neanderthals were gone. Not pushed to the margins, not reduced, gone. The last confirmed Neanderthal remains date to roughly 40,000 years ago, from caves in Gibraltar at the southwestern tip of Europe. A peninsula backed up against the sea, and then nothing. A species that had survived for over 400,000 years simply stopped leaving remains. Something ended them. And we were there when it happened. But the Neanderthals were not the only ones. In 2008, archaeologists pulled a fragment of bone from the sediment of a cave in the Altai Mountains of Siberia. A piece of a finger from a child, small enough to sit in the bowl of your palm. When researchers extracted DNA from it, what they found didn't match anything in the database. Not Neanderthal. Not Homo sapiens. A third species of human, entirely unknown to science, identified from a bone you could lose in a coat pocket. They named them after the cave, the Denisovans. So far, we have found almost nothing physical that belonged to them. No skulls, no complete skeletons. A handful of bone fragments and 2 teeth is all that remains of an entire human species. But the genetic record they left inside living populations tells a story their bodies cannot. And that story reaches forward all the way to today. In 2010, geneticist Svante Pabo and his team at the Max Planck Institute published the first complete Neanderthal genome. What they found has not stopped being strange. Non-African modern humans carry between 1% and 4% Neanderthal DNA. People across East Asia and the Pacific carry up to 6% Denisovan DNA. Some populations carry traces of both. That DNA is not a fossil. It is inside you right now, active, doing things. And it got there only one way. Before these species disappeared, we had children with them. Not once, not accidentally. At multiple points in time, across different continents, over thousands of years, Homo sapiens and Neanderthals interbred. Homo sapiens and Denisovans interbred. We looked at each other and recognized something close enough. And then their species ended and ours didn't. And we carried pieces of them forward without knowing we were doing it. There was no single massacre, no war that ended them in a season. The evidence doesn't support that kind of clean story, and it never will, because what actually happened was slower and harder to name. Homo sapiens had larger social networks. We traveled farther, traded resources across hundreds of miles, and carried information in ways Neanderthals simply didn't match. Our tools changed faster. Our strategies were more flexible. When the climate shifted, when prey animals moved, when one food source collapsed, we adapted. Neanderthals were specialists. We were generalists, and when two species occupy the same ground and compete for the same animals in the same shelter in the same valleys, the specialist loses. Not necessarily through violence, through presence, through numbers, through the slow arithmetic of one group having slightly more children per generation than the other, decade after decade, for thousands of years. Some Neanderthals were absorbed into our population. Their DNA survived inside us. The rest had fewer children, generation by generation, until a small group was living in caves in Gibraltar, with the Atlantic behind them, and no other Neanderthals anywhere to their north. And then there were none. The fossil record doesn't show us that last moment, but someone was last. A final Neanderthal, in a cave at the edge of a continent, surrounded by a species that had replaced them without ever deciding to. But they did not disappear entirely. The Neanderthal DNA inside non-African modern humans is not inert, it is active. Genes inherited from Neanderthals help regulate how your immune system responds to bacterial infection. There are Neanderthal variants linked to blood clotting speed and to skin and hair adaptation in low sunlight environments. There are Neanderthal genetic signatures connected to sleep timing, the internal clock that tells your body when to stay alert and when to shut down. The chronotype that makes you a morning person or a night person may carry the imprint of a species that has been gone for 40,000 years. Your body is still running their code, not as a memory, as structure. Go back to that valley. Two people on opposite sides. One of them your ancestor, newly arrived, carrying tools and a larger social world. The other, standing in a landscape his people had lived in for 200,000 years, carrying something we still cannot fully name. They didn't know what was happening. They had no word for extinction, no understanding of what their meeting would eventually mean. They were just two kinds of people trying to last through the same winter. One of them is still here, one of them isn't. And the only reason that matters to you is that you are which one you are. But the other people are not entirely gone. They are inside you. After everything, after 40,000 years of silence, still running, quietly, in the body of the species that outlasted them.